Welcome. Today's going to be a particularly fun episode for all the music lovers and music nerds out there, because today I'm joined by Dr. David Barry, professor of music from Converse University and composer. We're here to talk about Dr. Barry's upcoming book, as well as the conference Resurrecting Romanticism, which is going to be taking place in October. There are going to be lots of leading objectivist thinkers on aesthetics and artists. So let's actually begin by talking about the conference. First of all, David, welcome to the Daily Objective. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Nicholas. It's good to see you too.
So can you tell us just a little bit about the Resurrecting Romanticism Conference? It's going to be over a weekend in early October. I know Dr. Binswanger is going to be there, Shoshana, and Lee Pearson. So tell us a little bit of what the conference is about, what it's going to be focused on, and what people have to look forward to.
Well, it's a 3-day conference, arts conference, Columbus Day weekend, which is October 7, 8, and 9. And we even have a lecture talking about a little about Columbus Day during it. And on the 3 days, the first day, the 7th, there will be lectures, and then there'll be a chamber music concert in the evening with Alan August tenor and as of now Allegra Durante singing some romantic vocal works, and then featuring string quartet and Dr. Dave Stephen Seek on piano playing the Schumann Piano Quintet. And then Sunday is our more lectures, and Dr. Binswanger will be the keynote speaker at the banquet, which will be held at the hotel. And then I think after that, we may have like a Scrabble game with Dr. Binswanger competing with people. And then on Sunday, we have more discussions and lectures. There are some panels. There are a couple of panels that are scheduled too. And then in the evening, there will be a concert with a 13-piece chamber orchestra. Thomas Schubaden will conduct the first part, which will have an instrumental overture, and then 3 vocal numbers from West Side Story, L'Elisir d'Amore, and Efkin Onegin. And then at the end of it, I've written a 40-minute one-act opera based on an O. Henry story, To Him Who Waits. And the work premiered back in 2002, but we'll have it, the orchestral version. This will be a premiere of the orchestral version in our recital hall at Converse University. And we call it, by the way, people ask Resurrecting Romanticism. As you're probably well aware, Ayn Rand discussed Romanticism a great deal in the Romantic Manifesto and said it's pretty much disappeared, except it comes up in isolated instances. And so we want to we're going to address at the conference ways that we might actually encourage people in academia and the general world to try to embrace the romantic aesthetic as defined by her, not the conventional romantic aesthetic that's never gone anywhere actually, or changed any. So that's kind of the theme behind the whole thing. And we have an architect, John Gillis, and we have Sandra Shaw, a sculptor, and Diane Durante, an art historian, and then Dr. Binswanger, Dr. Lee Pearson on a panel. Stephen Seek, of course, will be playing piano. I think that covers everything.
That sounds like a really exciting conference. And for the record, the Schumann Piano Quintet in E-flat is one of my all-time favorite chamber works. So I think that'll be a real treat for your audience. Can you tell us a little bit about your O. Henry opera, which is going to be, you said the orchestral version is going to be premiered at the conference?
Yes, and also Shoshana Milgram will be giving a talk about, she's an O. Henry expert. She actually invited me to join an O. Henry Society, and I've been attending their meetings, and they're all excited about it. Apparently, no one's ever written an O. Henry opera before. The story, of course, it has a surprise ending, so if you want to see it in the opera, you should probably not read the story, but otherwise, it's called To Him Who Waits. And Shoshana actually told me I've been under a misapprehension for a long time. There's a book of O. Henry stories that says that O. Henry made a musical out of it called Low. And that's what attracted me to it. And I said, boy, this is really great. And it turns out that the Low, the musical that he contributed lyrics for, is not to him who waits. So I'm the only person to have ever said that. And one of my goals was to try to capture O. Henry's language and the time. So I've taken every single spoken word out of the story and set it to music. And then I have a friend, a very good friend of mine, he's passed away a couple of years ago, Ralph Rivera. He created some lyrical poems for me to put in there to make them more opera-like. And I think the video I sent you is one of those. And those are his lyrics. But it's all O. Henry except for the contributions by Ralph Rivera.
Wonderful. And for our viewers who don't know his work, O. Henry is a wonderful writer. I read many collections of his stories decades ago and found them touching and moving and quite exciting. Now, by the time of the conference, you're hoping that your book that you've been working on for some years will be completed. Your book, How Music Moves Us, The Rule of Two and Beyond. This book it takes as its starting point some ideas in the introduction to objectivist epistemology, the Romantic Manifesto. So you're building on some of Rand's ideas. There are also some ways in which you're contributing your own insights, your own reflections, and perhaps departing from some principles or some ideas that Rand lays out in her writings on, for example, the essay Art and Cognition. Let's just begin by talking about what are some ideas by Rand that have influenced your thinking about music, your thinking of aesthetics, and the connection with epistemology, psychoepistemology.
Well, I have to state, back in 1970, thereabouts, I went to a live lectures with Marianne Suries on the aesthetics of visual arts. And I was in college at the time. And I had I didn't even know what aesthetics were. Most people don't know what they are. And I was so inspired as a music major at the time. I said, has anybody, what is music and how does it do what it does? And I noticed there really weren't any answers for that. So I embarked on a journey to try to find the answers. There are two basic questions I'm trying to answer. One of, and in my book, I've tried to answer. One is when Art and Cognition came out in the paperback version of the Romantic Manifesto, I read it and I said, this woman knows exactly what she's talking about. And I'm starting with her definition of art. She says, art is a selective recreation of reality according to an artist's metaphysical value judgments. And so to me, the question was, what does music selectively recreate? And the fact that it's just tones and rhythms and sounds, it doesn't appear to be conceptual on the surface. That's the great mystery of music. So I sought out to find an answer to that. And I actually, through introspection and thinking about music, I think I did find the answer. All the way back then, I've written two essays. The one that's the first chapter in my book, I wrote in 1982, but it's never been published. And I basically agree with everything she says. So I've met many people over the years who disagree, sometimes with major points or minor points. It just turns out that there's one area where she is very, very vague and it's not clear what she's talking about. And the second thing is that there are several major issues in music she does not address at all, and even partially admits to that in Art and Cognition. And just to take it a step further, back in the end of the 90s, I was part of a phone conference. We called it Philosophy of Music. And I'm trying to decide how much of that to put in my book, because I have 111 pages of Word documents of emails and stuff. The members of the conference, Kathy Cross, was actually kind of coordinated it. Harry Binswanger was the moderator, and Alan Gotthelf, Stephen Seek, myself, Matt Johnson, Jeff Britting, who else? Thomas Schubotham, probably, somebody named Jeffrey Linden, who I've lost touch with. We all talk sometimes as often on the phone for well over an hour, a phone conference for often twice a month from like 1998 through 2002. And basically we spent most of the time trying to pull this essay that I have in the first chapter of my book apart. So I really think I ought to publish those things, because I think many objectivists would find the conversation quite scintillating. But I'm probably oversharing here, so I'll let you jump back in. So that's kind of what's going on. That's where it comes from.
And I think one of the points you address in your book is this aspect of the selective recreation, and what exactly is it that music selectively recreates. So part of your thesis involves recreating physical action and psychological action. Can you sort of concisely explain what you mean by those points?
Well, when I was trying to solve the problem, I said, well, what is music actually doing? And, as you well know, being a trained musician yourself, that, it takes place in time. And even though drama takes place in time, time is not a crucial element, whereas in music, it is. We parse time by creating rhythm and meter, the beat. And so tones seem to behave a certain way, especially, I'll just simplify it for now, like a melody seems to move up and down, faster or slower. And so I thought, well, it's what it has in common with objects, with concepts, is there are things in the world that go up and down and move faster and slower. And so I call that physical action. And, of course, rhythm contributes to that, meter contributes to that. And then, and by the way, I fought with myself for a long time. Should I use the word motion or action? And then I realized that action is the wider concept that embraces motions, because another type of action in which nothing moves is thought or emotions. And so I said, well, what aspect of music creates a mood or and it's not involving something physical moving? And then I realized that thinking, feelings, and I realized harmony. Again, all the elements contribute to those things, but harmony and form seem to impact mostly on creating a mood or an emotion psychologically. And so that's actually basically it.
That leads me to the question, how important is programmatic music? By programmatic music, I mean descriptive music, music that is meant to explicitly describe a narrative or paint a scene. How central is that to your theory? Or is that something you touch on in your book?
I touch on several times, and we talked about it intensively during the Palm sessions too. My attitude is, they contrast program music to absolute music, which is like, Sonata number 1. What's that about? Whereas, raindrops in the forest, you have a picture there. And basically my statement, my attitude is all music is program music, all music is absolute music. Because we, as human beings, we usually attach a program to something, whether it needs it or not. In other words, it brings up images in our minds. That's such a common thing, it barely needs discussing. But at the same time, like in my talk, that when I call music, architecture is frozen music, music is moving architecture. And so that's going on at the same time, and that's contributing to our emotional reactions too.
Just to clarify, when you say that from a certain point of view, all music is programmatic music, is that primarily from the listener's point of view or from the composer, creator's point of view?
Both.
Or both?
Yeah, the composer does not have to have a program, though many of the most popular composers did, even if they didn't write them down. They confessed in letters and whatever that they had a very clear picture of something in mind. But it's not essential to have a program, but all music has to have emotional content, and that emotional content has to be expressed. And whether you associate it with a picture or a story, or just let the notes speak for themselves, the emotional content is the one constant that links both the programmatic and the absolute aspects of the music.
Something that's come up in a lot of recent musicological writing over the past couple of decades, which I have mixed feelings about this, but it's the application of semiotics to music, the study of musical signs. So, for example, talking about semiotics in the 18th century, someone will take apart a Mozart piano sonata and they'll say, well, in this particular passage, Mozart is referring to, say, church music, something that sounds like a chorale. And here he's referring to martial music. Here there's a bit of storm and stress. Here there's maybe a hint of a dance, a hint of a minuet. Do you think there's anything to that? Do you think there's any benefit in analyzing music from the point of view of what the composer might have been communicating to contemporary audiences, what an 18th century audience would have gotten out of a Mozart piece or a Haydn piece, for example?
Well, absolutely. If we just go back to when I say all music is programmatic, all music is absolute, that's exactly what's going on. And I forget, I just started reading a book about the Galant period, talking about how, music had different signs or something to the audience of that era. And of course it did. But that actually made me think about something kind of controversial, I say, but I'll save that for later.
Well, please, let's be controversial. We love being controversial.
Well, the funny thing is, the one thing I spent a lot of time thinking about intellectual history, reading about it, and those who've studied history know very well that the modern mind actually, in fact, historians who know nothing about objectivism say the modern mind was created in the Enlightenment, a whole new way of looking at the world, and that's why there are all these new forms. By the way, that's why the symphony and the sonata and the novel and everything were all born during the Enlightenment, and so that made me realize that music before the Enlightenment had to be experienced and listened to in a way that's somewhat foreign to us. So, like this is the controversial part. When we listen to something by Palestrina, for instance, a motet or something from the 16th century, we have all these romantic and post-Enlightenment emotional reactions to the music that I don't think Palestrina had any idea that he was expressing, and his audiences didn't have any idea that were being expressed. We interpret it through a post-Enlightenment lens, rather than seeing it as they did. Now, but that doesn't cause any problems because it's the same notes, the same chords, the same melodies. They're beautiful. So the fact that we don't hear them the way a 16th century person heard them doesn't hurt the music at all, because the music's actual essence is universal and timeless.
And another distinction is that, say, a mass by Palestrina or a motet, it would have been performed in a certain context. It would have been performed as part of a church service at the Sistine Chapel where Palestrina was employed. Whereas nowadays you listen to it either in a concert or, say, on a CD or a streaming. We're listening to these pieces as if they were symphonies or as if they were masses by Haydn or Mozart, which is a completely different sort of experience. In Palestrina's context, the emphasis would have been on the actual ceremony itself, the elevation of the host, and all the different readings from the Gospels and everything else that went along with it.
And they wouldn't have, I don't think they heard it as programmatic. They might have, but we don't know because we're post-Enlightenment people. So we have a different perspective. Another thing, a colleague of mine pointed something out, you have a musical education, a university musical education. We're taught all about the medieval motets. And it turns out that we have no idea when and where those things were performed. In other words, the body of work isn't written down. Like, for instance, you probably remember that they wrote these motets that had a French text and then a Latin text, and the French text was rather romantic and the Latin text was ecclesiastical. And my theory is they were writing them both down. They weren't meant to be done together. You did one or the other, but there's no other musicologist. I've never heard another musicologist say that. But it was not surprising to find out that there's virtually no evidence of, even though we have these manuscripts that we can look at, we have no evidence of the context in which they were performed, or if they were performed in that way.
Yeah, I know that some of them would have been performed by scholars, monks, for each other, for their own amusement. Something else that starts to emerge in the 15th and 16th century is a kind of rudimentary musical symbolism. For example, you start to see this in Josquin and some composers, where, for example, when the text is referring to something rising, then the music will do that. When the text is referring to something descending, like there's that famous Ave Maria by Josquin, where it talks, there's these descending figures, where it talks about the Holy Spirit descending, and then you see that more and more in the madrigals, the Italian madrigals from the late 16th century, where there are some very explicit attempts of the music to depict what the poetic text is actually saying. Now, let me just quickly.
By the way, you realize my aesthetic theory says that's perfectly appropriate, logical, and probably absolutely correct.
Absolutely. Now let's just quickly check in with our producer, Daniel. I understand we have some super chats and some comments and questions from our viewers.
So no super chat so far, but someone is asking, when will the book be available?
Okay, David, tell us about the publication, the projected publication of your book.
It's going into InDesign right now, and I'm going to I'm using BookBaby to distribute it and print it and everything. So there are just a couple things I'm polishing up right at the moment. And so I'm keeping my eyes crossed and my fingers and everything else crossed, and expecting to send it to them within the next 2 weeks. And so it should be the middle of September, which at least gives us a little bit of lead time into the conference.
Okay, and you're hoping that, will you have copies of your book available at the conference?
Yes, I'm planning on having copies there. And also I'm making an electronic version that will be available. My Kindle version might be a little late showing up, but Apple Books and EPUB and all of those things should be available at the same time that the printed version is available.
And is the talk you're giving at the conference, the architecture talk, is that based on some ideas from your book, or is that something a little bit separate?
Well, I decided to do something slightly perverse. One of the, I don't really consider this a disagreement with Ayn Rand, but she says architecture is a fine art, but it's not like the other arts. It doesn't recreate anything in reality. And I thought as a backdoor into my music aesthetics, it might be fun. I won't tell you exactly how I'm going to do it, but I was going to point out, actually, she's understating the case. Architecture does selectively recreate reality. Architecture is even more powerful, according to her definition, than even she said it was. So, I'm using that as a kind of a reverse way to get to my theses in my book.
Okay, and since we're being a little bit controversial on this show, I sometimes shock other objectivists when I say that I'm an admirer of a lot of music of Arnold Schoenberg. What is your position on Schoenberg and atonal music in general? Because I know I looked in the titles of your, the table of contents of your book, you talk about tonal melodies and what distinguishes a good tonal melody. Do you have a position on some of the innovations of Arnold Schoenberg and 20th century composers and atonal music more generally?
Well, in the first place, I have a chapter called "What is Dissonant About Dissonance?" And I try to explain what's going on there. By the way, I saw that at Ocon you did a talk on Wagner. Shame, shame, shame. Wagner's my favorite composer. Well, Richard Strauss is my favorite composer. Wagner's my second favorite. Now I'd probably put Mozart in there somewhere. And in my book, I actually have a section. I have a few measures from the Berg Violin Concerto, and he was part of that school with Arnold Schoenberg and Webern. In my chapter on the rule of two, I point out that even when the harmony is extremely dissonant and hard to follow, there's still the same structural elements that you'll find in earlier music. And of course, Schoenberg, being the founder of that school, he incorporates all of the elements of post-romantic music. But I think that the nature of serialism and 12-tone music as such is impossible to integrate. And so you can like it, you can enjoy it, and also, it has a place. The movie The Planet of the Apes, Jerry Goldsmith used 12-tone music actually for the whole score. So where I differ with a lot of people is it has an expressive range, an emotional range, but it's very narrow.
Also, speaking of film music, the composer David Shire, who wrote the music for The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, he actually uses Schoenberg's 12-tone method in the score for that film.
Right, and John Williams in E.T., the extraterrestrial, the dialogue between the guy playing the synthesizer and the aliens is 12-tone.
You mean Close Encounters? Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Sorry, Close Encounters. Thank you.
Yeah.
So it proves that it has emotional content and it has a context, but I prefer music that can go from lighthearted and beautiful to dark and dreary, has that kind of range. And for me, the use of dissonance and the destruction of tonality, which was his intent, narrows its emotional range quite a bit. But there's still so much to admire. He still was a great musician. He knew what he was doing, even though it wasn't necessarily a good idea to do it.
I do think the Albanberg Violin Concerto is one of the most beautiful and moving works to come from that particular school of composition. So that's something.
Well, I do too, but I find myself always waiting for the Bach chorale, and so glad when it finally shows up.
Yes. So let me check in one last time with Daniel. Do we have any other questions, super chats, or announcements for other shows today?
We have a super chat from Jonathan. Thank you so much. And also a super chat from Christopher. Thank you so much. And another super chat just came in from Gene. Thank you so much. He says, apologies if I missed it. Who is the target audience for How Music Moves Us? Will musicians benefit from reading it?
Oh, okay. So let's have that as our final question. Who is and I know you mentioned this in the introduction to the book, who is your intended audience?
Well, I kept changing my mind on it, and I realized at the end of the day, because of the discussion, several of the chapters, a trained musician who's interested in music philosophy is the ideal person. But I think there are, as the Brits love to say, bleeding chunks that someone who's just had a little training, like piano lessons or been in a band, and has a curiosity about philosophical ideas. I think there's a good deal in there that they will enjoy. And I'm also going to make available recordings of the musical examples so that people can hear what I'm talking about. So even if they can't read the music, they can get an idea. This is just me. I've been collecting these things all these years, and call it my last will and testament or something. I just wanted to get it out there and make it available for anyone who might be interested.
Well, I think there's a lot of interest and a lot of curiosity among objectivists for music in general. So I think there'll be a lot of interest in your book. David Barry, thank you very much for joining today. I hope we can chat again soon. I hope the conference in October goes well. Thank you to all our viewers. And we'll have some information in the description, the video description, about the upcoming conference and how to register for it. Thanks again to all our viewers, all our super chats, our producer, Daniel. And I wish you all a fine day. And Daniel, are there any final announcements before we wrap up?
In 1 minute, the reality show. Make sure to join us. The link is in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Again, thank you to our viewers. And with that, I wish you all the best of premises.